My mother, who banned me from family events for being a disappointment, didn't know I graduated from Harvard Law until my aunt brought my diploma to Thanksgiving dinner. My mother decided I was the family failure when I dropped out of nursing school at 19. Not disappointed, she actually used the word failure. Told me I'd wasted her genetics, her time, her money on raising someone who couldn't even finish a basic degree. She called my aunts, uncles, cousins, explained that I was too embarrassing to have at family gatherings anymore. Said seeing me would just remind everyone of wasted potential. Literally uninvited me from Christmas that year via text message. Don't come. Your presence would ruin the mood for people who actually achieved something. I was living in my car at the time, working double shifts at a warehouse, trying to figure out my next move. She didn't know and didn't care to ask. My Aunt Kathy found me crying in a grocery store parking lot that Christmas Eve. Took me home, fed me, let me sleep in her guest room. Never told my mother. She helped me apply to community college, co-signed my apartment lease, showed up when I had no one. I studied paralegal courses during the day, worked at a law firm at night filing papers. The lawyers started noticing I understood the cases better than some first-year associates. One partner offered to write me a recommendation letter if I applied to law school. Took the LSAT 4 times before getting a score high enough for decent schools. My aunt drove me to every test. Applied to 14 law schools with fee waivers, got into Harvard. My mother was telling everyone I was probably homeless or in jail. She'd created an entire narrative about my failure, used me as a cautionary tale at family dinners about what happens when children don't listen to their parents. 3 years of law school without a word to my mother. Graduated magna cum laude, law review editor, job offer from a federal judge for a prestigious clerkship. My Aunt Kathy sat front row at graduation, cried harder than anyone. My mother was posting on social media about successful mothers raising successful children, meaning my brother who managed a phone store. She'd comment on family photos about being blessed with one good child, implying she had only one child total. Relatives stopped asking about me. If someone mentioned my name, she'd say, "We don't discuss that," like I'd died or committed murder. I passed the bar exam on my first try. Started working for the Justice Department. Argued my first federal case at 28. Won. My aunt kept a scrapbook of every achievement. Last Thursday was Thanksgiving at my grandmother's house. I hadn't been to a family gathering in 9 years. Aunt Kathy convinced me to let her handle something special. I trusted her completely. The whole family gathered, 37 people, my mother holding court about my brother's promotion to district manager. She was mid-story about how she'd raised him with values and direction when Aunt Kathy stood up, said she had an announcement. My mother looked annoyed at being interrupted. Kathy pulled out a folder, started pulling out documents. My law degree, my bar certification, letters of recommendation from federal judges, an article about my latest case from the Washington Post. She laid them out on the dining table like playing cards while everyone went silent. "Since some people seem unaware," Kathy said, looking directly at my mother, "your daughter graduated from Harvard Law. She's a federal prosecutor." My mother's face went through 17 different expressions. She grabbed the diploma, checking if it was real. Started stammering about misunderstandings and communication issues. My uncle asked how long I'd been a lawyer. Kathy answered for me. Said 4 years. 4 years of my mother not knowing anything about my life. My grandmother asked my mother how she could not know her own daughter was at Harvard. My mother tried to say I'd hidden it from her. Kathy pulled out her phone, showed text messages of my mother saying she didn't care what I was doing, that I was dead to her, that mentioning my name was forbidden. My cousin asked why my mother had been saying I was a failure all these years. The room turned into chaos. Relatives demanding explanations. My grandmother crying about missed years. My brother admitting he'd known but was told not to say anything. My mother tried to hug me, saying we could start fresh. I stepped back. Told her she was right about one thing. I was a disappointment. Kathy drove me to Thanksgiving that day. She also drove me home. But my mother found out my address from my brother, showed up the next day and said, "We need to discuss my monthly fund." I stand in my doorway staring at my mother on the doorstep, her words hanging in the air like poison. My hands grip the doorframe to keep steady, and I tell her I'm not discussing anything tonight, my voice surprisingly calm despite the crash hitting me. She starts to push past me into the apartment, but I step into the doorway blocking her, repeating that she needs to leave. My mother's face shifts through confusion, then anger, then this calculated sweetness as she tries different approaches to get inside. She says we're both adults and can talk about this reasonably, that she just needs a few minutes to explain her situation. I stay planted in the doorway and tell her we're done for tonight, that if she wants to talk, it needs to be another time with proper notice. She switches back to anger, saying I'm being dramatic and childish, that after everything at Thanksgiving, I owe her the chance to speak. I repeat that she needs to leave, my voice getting firmer. She steps back but says she'll wait in her car until I'm ready to be reasonable, and I close the door and lock it right away. Through my peephole, I watch her stand in the hallway for what feels like forever, maybe 5 minutes, before she finally turns and walks toward the elevator. The second she's gone, I'm calling Kathy with shaking hands, barely able to hold the phone steady. Kathy answers on the first ring, and I barely get out the words before breaking down. She tells me to stay put, Check all my locks and she'll be there in 20 minutes. I do a full check of every window latch and door lock, then sit on my couch trying to slow my breathing. My phone buzzes with a text from my brother and my stomach drops before I even read it. The message says Mom really needs help. Just hear her out. I stare at the screen realizing he's the only one who could have given her my address since I've kept it private from everyone except Kathy. The hurt hits different from my mother's behavior because I'd thought he at least stayed neutral in all this, that he wasn't actively helping her track me down. Another text comes through saying I'm making this harder than it needs to be. That family helps family. I don't respond, just screenshot both messages and add them to a folder. Kathy arrives exactly 20 minutes later with an overnight bag, and I unlock the door after checking the peephole 3 times. She comes inside and immediately starts making tea while I pace my apartment, words spilling out about the doorstep demand and my brother's betrayal, and how she found my address. Kathy listens while the kettle heats, then calmly says we need a plan for the morning, that tonight is just about feeling safe and getting sleep. I know she's right, but sleep feels impossible with my mind racing through worse scenarios about my mother showing up at my workplace, or causing a scene at the courthouse, or calling my boss. Kathy sets up on my couch with blankets and tells me to try to rest, that she's here and nothing will happen tonight. I lie awake in my bed most of the night replaying the Thanksgiving dinner, and imagining my mother tracking down my office building, calling my colleagues, showing up during court hearings. Every small sound in the building makes me jump. Footsteps in the hallway or doors closing or the elevator dinging. Kathy sleeps on my couch and I'm grateful not to be alone, but I can't stop my brain from spinning through possibilities. Around 4 in the morning, I finally drift off from pure exhaustion, my body just giving up on staying alert. I wake up a few hours later to 3 missed calls from my mother and another text from my brother. This one says she just wants what's fair, that I owe her for raising me. My hands shake as I show Kathy, who reads the messages with a tight look on her face. She suggests I send one clear text to my mother setting a boundary, then block her number and switch to email-only contact. I spend 30 minutes drafting and redrafting the message, trying to find words that are firm but not cruel, clear but not emotional. Kathy reads each version and helps me cut out anything that could be twisted or used against me. The final text says, I will not be providing any money. If she needs to contact me, use email only. Do not come to my home or workplace again. My finger hovers over the send button for a full minute before I press it. Kathy watches me block my mother's number right after sending, then helps me block the 3 other numbers my mother tries calling from over the next hour. Each blocked call feels like a small victory but also makes my stomach hurt. I get ready for work, moving on autopilot, putting on my suit and grabbing my briefcase while Kathy makes coffee. She offers to drive me to the office, but I tell her I need to try doing normal things, that I can't let this derail my whole life. My mother leaves 4 voicemails on my work phone before I even get to the office, each one cycling between saying she's my mother and deserves respect to listing everything she gave up for me to warning that I'll regret treating family this way. I save them all as records, my stomach turning as I listen to her voice shift from sweet to angry to threatening. My colleague Sydney notices me looking shaken at my desk and asks if everything's okay. I give a vague answer about family stress, not ready to explain the whole situation at work. Sydney nods like she understands and brings me coffee, which helps more than she probably knows. My supervisor Gwendolyn calls me into her office mid-morning, and my heart drops thinking somehow my mother already contacted the department. Instead, Gwendolyn gently says she noticed I seem distracted and asks if there's anything affecting my work I need to discuss. I make a split-second decision to be honest, and tell her I'm dealing with a family member who's become pushy, and I'm handling it, but wanted her aware in case there are any attempted contacts to the office. Gwendolyn takes it seriously and asks if I feel safe, whether I need any help with building security or HR documentation. I explain the situation briefly, keeping it professional and factual, and she immediately says she'll loop in the right people to make sure I'm protected at work. The relief I feel is huge, knowing my workplace will have my back if my mother tries to show up here. Gwendolyn picks up her phone and calls HR while I'm still sitting across from her desk, putting it on speaker so I can hear the conversation. She explains the situation to someone named Rita, describing it as a potential security concern involving family harassment of a federal employee. Rita asks if I'm comfortable coming down to her office right now to file a formal report, and Gwendolyn looks at me for confirmation before I nod. We walk down 2 floors together, and Rita has me fill out an incident report form, documenting every contact my mother has made since showing up at my apartment. She asks specific questions about whether I feel physically safe, whether my mother has made any threats, whether I need any workplace accommodations. I explain about the voicemails and the demands for money, and Rita types everything into her computer with a serious expression. She prints out a copy for me and one for building security, then walks me down to the security office herself. The head of security, a guy in his 50s with gray hair, listens carefully as Rita explains the situation, and I provide my mother's full name and a description. He pulls up the visitor log system on his computer and adds a note that she's not authorized for building access under any circumstances, flagging it as a security alert. He gives me his direct cell number and tells me to call immediately if she shows up, or if I see her anywhere near the building. Walking back to my desk, I feel protected in a way I haven't since this started, knowing there are official systems in place now instead of just me trying to handle it alone. That evening, I'm heating up leftovers when my phone buzzes with a message from my cousin Jennifer, someone I haven't talked to in probably 5 years. She sends me a screenshot of a Facebook post my mother made an hour ago, something vague about how some children forget where they came from and turn their backs on the people who sacrificed everything for them. The post already has 23 comments, mostly from relatives I barely remember, and my mother's friends, all saying supportive things about what a good mother she is and how ungrateful kids are these days. My hands shake as I read through the comments, seeing my mother play the victim to an audience who has no idea what actually happened. I screenshot the post and all the comments before my mother can delete them, saving them to a folder on my phone that Kathy told me to start keeping. The folder already has the voicemails, the texts from my brother, and photos of my mother at my apartment door from my building's security footage that the concierge helped me get. Each piece of evidence feels like protection, but also like proof that this is really happening, that my mother is escalating instead of backing off. I text the screenshot to Kathy with no comment, because I don't know what to say, and she responds within minutes saying to save everything, and that we're building a solid documentation trail. My grandmother calls around 9 that night, and her voice sounds tired and sad in a way that makes my chest hurt. She asks if we can all just sit down and talk things through like family, maybe have dinner at her house where everyone can say their piece calmly. I love my grandmother and I know she means well, but I tell her gently that talking didn't work for 9 years when I was the one being shut out, and my mother wouldn't even let people mention my name. I explain that I need space right now to figure things out and protect myself, that I'm not trying to hurt anyone, but I also can't let my mother harass me just because she's family. My grandmother is quiet for a long moment and then says she understands, though her voice sounds hurt. She asks me to at least keep her updated so she doesn't worry, and I promise I will because I don't want her caught in the middle of this. After we hang up, I sit on my couch feeling guilty even though I know I'm doing the right thing, wishing family could be simple instead of this complicated mess. Kathy shows up at my apartment after work the next day with her laptop bag and a determined expression. She sets up at my kitchen table and opens her laptop, then starts showing me things I've never seen before. Screenshots of text messages between her and my mother from years ago, back when I first got cut off from the family. Email chains where my mother told relatives I was worthless and would probably end up in prison. Messages where my mother specifically told people not to help me because I needed to learn consequences the hard way. Kathy has been saving all of it for years, creating a digital record of every cruel thing my mother said about me when she thought I'd never see it. Reading the messages hits harder than I expected because seeing the words in writing makes them more real somehow. My mother called me a waste of space in an email to my uncle. She told Kathy I was going to end up homeless and that it would serve me right. She said in a group text that some children are just born wrong and can't be fixed. Kathy watches me read through everything with a sad but steady expression, and when I finally look up, she says, "This is why she's been documenting, because she knew one day I might need proof that I'm not overreacting or being dramatic." The cruelty documented in black and white validates every boundary I'm trying to set now. My phone rings from a number I don't recognize the next afternoon while I'm reviewing case files at my desk. I answer thinking it might be work-related, and my brother's voice comes through immediately, not even saying hello first. He launches into this explanation about how my mother is in a financial crisis, behind on her mortgage by 3 months, and she thought I'd want to help her now that I'm successful and making good money. The way he frames it makes anger flash through me because he's acting like this is somehow my responsibility, like my mother's money problems are my problem to solve. But I also hear stress in his voice that makes me pause and wonder what kind of pressure he's under from her. He keeps talking about how she just needs help getting back on her feet, how family is supposed to help family, how I have the means now to make a real difference. I cut him off and say I'm not discussing money with him or my mother, that this conversation is over. But before I hang up, I ask him directly why he gave her my address when he knew I kept it private from everyone except Kathy. The question makes him go quiet for a long moment. When my brother finally speaks again, his voice is quieter, and he admits my mother threatened to kick him out of her house if he didn't help her contact me. The words shift something in my understanding of the whole situation because I realize he's still living under her roof at 32 years old, still financially dependent on her, still subject to her control and manipulation. He explains he's been trying to save money to move out, but it's hard on his salary, and my mother knows he can't afford his own place yet, so she uses that as leverage. I feel a complicated mix of anger at him for giving up my address and sympathy for realizing he's trapped in his own way. I tell him I can't fix his situation, and he needs to make his own choices about what he's willing to tolerate, but I also won't be his enemy if he can start respecting my boundaries. He says he understands and apologizes for everything, and I believe he means it even though I'm not ready to fully trust him yet. After we hang up, I sit at my desk thinking about how my mother has controlled both of us in different ways, using money and housing and family pressure as weapons. That evening, Kathy comes over again, and we spend 3 hours at my kitchen table researching legal options on our laptops. We look up information about cease and desist letters, restraining orders, harassment documentation requirements, and what constitutes legally actionable behavior. Kathy takes notes in a notebook while I bookmark relevant legal websites and articles. We talk through the pros and cons of each option, weighing whether we're overreacting or actually need legal intervention. I'm hesitant to involve lawyers because it feels like such a huge escalation, but Kathy points out that my mother has already escalated by showing up at my home, demanding money and violating the boundaries I tried to set verbally. We decide I should consult with a private attorney rather than using anyone connected to my work, keeping clear boundaries between my personal situation and my professional reputation. Kathy mentions she knows a family law attorney named Phyllis, who specifically handles estrangement cases and difficult family dynamics. She offers to reach out and make an introduction, and I agree because having professional legal guidance feels necessary at this point. The next morning, I'm getting ready for work when an email notification pops up on my phone from my mother's email address. The subject line says "Invoice for services rendered," and my stomach drops before I even open it. I sit down on my bed and click the email, finding a detailed breakdown that makes my hands start shaking. She's listed estimated costs for raising me from birth to 18, including line items for food, housing, education, clothing, medical care, and even something labeled emotional labor. The total comes to over $200,000. At the bottom, she's written a note saying a monthly payment plan of $2,000 would be fair compensation for her investment in raising me, and that as a successful federal prosecutor, I can easily afford this. She includes payment instructions and says she expects the first payment by the end of the month. I read through the invoice 3 times trying to process that my mother actually made a spreadsheet billing me for my childhood, treating my existence like a business transaction that needs to be repaid with interest. I forward the invoice email to Kathy and Phyllis without adding any comment because I'm too stunned to even formulate a response. My brain can't quite process what I'm seeing, the actual audacity of billing your own child for raising them. Kathy calls me within minutes, her voice tight with anger, asking if I'm okay, and telling me to save the original email and not respond. Phyllis replies within an hour with a professional message saying this type of manipulation is more common than I'd think in estrangement cases, and that it's actually helpful documentation of harassment for any legal proceedings. She writes that parents attempting to bill adult children for childhood expenses has no legal standing whatsoever, and shows a pattern of financial coercion. She offers to meet with me today or tomorrow to discuss options for establishing legal boundaries, and I respond saying, tomorrow afternoon works, because I need a day to process this. I spend the rest of the morning at work trying to focus on my cases, but my mind keeps drifting back to that invoice, to my mother calculating the cost of every meal she ever fed me. That weekend, Kathy suggests we visit my grandmother together, and I agree because I don't want my grandmother caught in the middle or fed lies about what's happening. We drive to her house Saturday afternoon and find her looking older than she did at Thanksgiving, more tired and worn down by the family drama. She hugs me tight before we even sit down, holding on longer than usual, and I can feel her shaking slightly. Over tea at her kitchen table, she starts telling me stories about my mother's childhood that I've never heard before. She talks about how my mother was always concerned with appearances and what the neighbors thought, how she'd get upset if my grandmother wore the wrong clothes to the school events, or if their house wasn't perfect when guests came over. My grandmother describes how my mother cut off her own sister, my grandmother's daughter, years ago over some perceived slight at a family wedding, and they didn't speak for 5 years. She tells me about my grandfather saying my mother kept score of every kindness and expected repayment with interest, how she'd bring up favors she'd done for people years later and demand equivalent returns. The stories give me context I never had before, painting a picture of generational patterns and image obsession that helps me understand my mother's behavior without excusing it. My grandmother holds my hand across the table and says she's sorry she didn't see these patterns clearly enough to protect me from them, and I tell her none of this is her fault. She keeps talking, telling me about my mother as a teenager refusing to wear hand-me-downs even when money was tight, how she'd rather skip meals than be seen in clothes that weren't new. My grandmother's voice gets quieter when she describes my grandfather pulling her aside one Christmas and saying my mother kept score of every kindness, that she'd bring up a favor years later and demand repayment with interest. The pattern clicks into place in my head. That invoice wasn't some desperate one-time thing, but completely consistent with how my mother views every relationship as a transaction. I'm processing this when headlights sweep across the kitchen window, and my grandmother glances out, then back to me with a worried expression. My brother's car pulls into the driveway and I feel my whole body tense up. He walks in looking like he hasn't slept in days, dark circles under his eyes, shoulders slumped in a way I've never seen before. He nods at Kathy and my grandmother, then looks at me and asks if we can talk privately. I don't want to, but Kathy gives me a small nod, so I follow him out the back door into my grandmother's small yard. The motion sensor light clicks on, and we stand there in the cold, my breath making clouds in the air. He starts talking before I can say anything, words tumbling out about how he's been my mother's go-between with relatives for years, delivering her version of events and actively discouraging people from reaching out to me. He admits he'd tell aunts and uncles I was doing fine when they asked, that I preferred being left alone, all while knowing my mother was calling me a failure. His voice cracks when he says he's tired of it, that he doesn't know how to extract himself when he's living in her house, and financially dependent on her letting him stay there. I cross my arms against the cold and tell him I can't fix his situation, that I won't be his enemy, but he needs to make his own choices about what he's willing to tolerate. He nods and looks at the ground, then admits my mother's debts are worse than he told me, that she's been borrowing money from relatives for years, and she's actually facing foreclosure on the house. I feel a small flicker of something that might be sympathy, but I remind myself that financial crisis doesn't justify 9 years of cruelty, or showing up at my door demanding monthly payments. We go back inside and I tell my grandmother I need to head home, hugging her tight and promising to visit again soon without all the drama. Kathy drives me back to my apartment and neither of us says much during the ride. Monday morning, I'm sitting in Phyllis's office, a small space with legal books lining the walls and case files stacked on every surface. I lay out the entire situation starting from being cut off at 19, through the 9 years of silence, the Thanksgiving revelation, my mother showing up at my door, the invoice email, all of it. Phyllis takes notes in a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and specific incidents. When I finish, she explains my options, starting with a formal cease and desist letter establishing clear boundaries and consequences, escalating to filing for a restraining order if the harassment continues after that. We decide to start with the letter, strongly worded but giving my mother one clear chance to back off before involving courts. Phyllis says she'll have a draft ready by the end of the week. I leave her office feeling like I've taken a concrete step instead of just reacting to whatever my mother does next. That afternoon, I schedule a meeting with my apartment building's property manager, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who manages 3 buildings in the area. I pull up photos of my mother on my phone and show them to her, explaining that this person is not welcome in the building under any circumstances, and police should be called if she appears. The manager takes it seriously, makes notes in her system, and offers to change my lock codes immediately. I accept, and she walks me through the new code twice to make sure I've got it. Walking back to my apartment with the new codes programmed, I feel slightly more secure knowing my mother can't talk her way past the front desk. The next day at work, my supervisor assigns me to a high-profile case involving federal fraud charges, the kind of case that could make or break a prosecutor's reputation. I throw myself into the preparation, grateful for the distraction and the reminder of what I've built here. The case files spread across my desk, witness statements and financial records that need careful analysis. Sydney stops by my office around 3 in the afternoon with coffee and comments that I seem more focused than I've been in weeks. I realize she's right, that taking active steps to protect myself has reduced the constant background anxiety that was making everything harder. The case research keeps my mind busy during the day, though nights are still difficult when I'm alone with my thoughts. Thursday morning, my mother emails again, this time with a softer tone saying she just wants to reconnect and start fresh, making no mention of the invoice or monthly fund like that whole thing never happened. I read it twice, recognizing the manipulation tactic immediately from years of watching her operate with other family members. The cycle is always the same. Pressure, then retreat, then pressure again, wearing people down until they give in. I don't respond, following Phyllis's advice to maintain no contact while we prepare the legal letter. Friday afternoon, Kathy calls me at work, which she never does, and I answer worried something happened to my grandmother. Instead, she tells me my mother showed up at her house an hour ago, pounding on the door and demanding to know what lies Kathy has been telling me. Kathy refused to engage and told my mother to leave, but my mother stood on the porch for 20 minutes yelling about betrayal before finally driving away. Kathy says she's worried about escalation, that my mother seems to be getting more desperate. I feel guilty that my boundary setting is affecting Kathy, pulling her into conflict she doesn't deserve. Kathy cuts me off firmly and says this isn't my fault, that she can handle my mother and I need to stop taking responsibility for other people's bad behavior. Monday morning, Phyllis emails me the completed cease and desist letter as a PDF attachment. I read through it twice, the legal language clear and firm, establishing that I'm requesting no contact except written communication regarding my grandmother's welfare, and that violations will result in legal action including potential restraining orders. Reading it makes the boundary feel real and enforceable rather than just words I'm saying into the void. The letter lists specific incidents with dates, including the doorstep visit, the invoice email, and the harassment at Kathy's house. I send Phyllis my approval and she responds that she'll send it via certified mail today so we have proof of delivery. For 3 days after that, I feel like I'm holding my breath waiting for my mother's reaction. Every time my phone buzzes, I jump. Every unfamiliar email makes my heart race. I check the tracking number Phyllis sent me obsessively, watching the letter make its way through the postal system. Kathy calls me Wednesday evening and reminds me that the waiting is part of the process, that I'm doing everything right, that I can't control how my mother responds, but I can control how I protect myself. I try to believe her. Thursday afternoon, the tracking shows my mother signed for the certified letter at 2:47 p.m., and by 6:15 p.m., my inbox pings with an email from her. The subject line reads, "Legal threats from my own daughter," and I feel my stomach drop before opening it. The email runs long and messy, jumping between how hurt she feels and claims that I'm using my legal training to bully my own mother. She writes about how she sacrificed everything raising me, and this is how I repay her, how I'm breaking her heart and destroying the family. Then she accuses me of turning Kathy against her, of poisoning my grandmother's mind, of being cruel and ungrateful. The worst part hits when I scroll down and see she copied my brother, 3 aunts, 2 uncles, and my grandmother on the email, clearly trying to get everyone on her side and make me look like the bad guy. I screenshot the email immediately and forward it to Phyllis with a note asking if this counts as violating the letter we just sent. My hands shake as I type, and I have to resist the urge to respond directly to defend myself. Within 20 minutes, my phone starts buzzing with email notifications as people begin replying to the group thread. I watch the chain grow with a weird mix of feelings, part of me wanting to see who supports me, and part of me wishing this whole thing would just disappear. My Uncle Robert replies first telling my mother that legal boundaries are reasonable, and she needs to respect them. Then my Uncle James adds that maybe everyone should take a step back and cool off. My grandmother responds asking everyone to please handle this privately, instead of through group emails. 2 of my aunts don't respond at all, and I wonder if they're staying neutral or just don't want to get involved. My brother replies saying we should all talk this through as a family, which feels like his usual middle ground approach. The email chain finally stops growing around 8 p.m., and I feel completely drained from watching it unfold. Kathy calls me right after the emails quiet down and asks how I'm holding up. I tell her I'm okay, just ready for this whole situation to be over and done with. She reminds me that my mother's public tactics are actually helping my case by showing the harassment clearly, but I still feel tired of the constant drama. Saturday morning, my brother emails me separately from his personal account, instead of replying to the group thread. He writes that my mother has been crying for 2 days straight and is threatening to show up at my office if I don't respond to her soon. He says she's barely eating and keeps talking about how I've abandoned her after everything she did for me. The email makes me feel guilty for about 30 seconds before I remember that I spent 9 years being the one who was abandoned, and nobody worried about me then. I forward his email to Phyllis and type out a question asking what happens if my mother actually violates the cease and desist by showing up at my workplace. Phyllis responds within an hour, explaining that we would document the violation carefully with photos, witness statements, and security footage if available. She writes that repeated violations would give us strong grounds to file for a restraining order through the courts. The idea of actual court proceedings against my own mother feels weird and wrong, but I know I'll follow through if she forces me to. I email Phyllis back saying I understand, and asking her to keep me updated on next steps. The rest of the weekend, I keep checking my work building's security protocols and making sure the front desk has my mother's photo and description. Monday morning, I take Phyllis up on her earlier suggestion and call to schedule an appointment with Camilla, the therapist who works with family situations like mine. The receptionist fits me in for Wednesday afternoon, and I mark it in my calendar, hoping therapy will help me process the constant guilt I feel about setting these boundaries. Wednesday arrives and I leave work early to make the appointment, driving across town to Camilla's office in a quiet professional building. The waiting room has comfortable chairs and soft lighting that's supposed to be calming, but I still feel nervous about opening up to a stranger. Camilla comes out to get me right on time. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm presence that immediately puts me somewhat at ease. We settle into her office and she asks me to tell her what brings me in, so I start explaining the whole situation from the beginning. I get through the estrangement, the Thanksgiving reveal, and my mother's current harassment before I completely break down crying. Camilla hands me tissues and waits patiently while I pull myself together enough to keep talking. I tell her about the guilt eating at me, how I feel like a terrible daughter for using legal letters against my own mother, how I wonder if I'm being too harsh or unforgiving. Camilla listens to everything without interrupting, and then asks me a simple question that stops me completely. She points out that I spent 9 years respecting my mother's boundary of not wanting me in her life, never showing up uninvited or demanding contact. She asks why my boundary of not wanting harassment is somehow less valid than my mother's boundary of disowning me. The question hits me hard because I've never thought about it that way, never considered that boundaries should work both directions. I sit there processing this new perspective while Camilla explains that boundaries aren't attacks, they're basic self-protection, and I have every right to protect my peace and safety. The session ends with me feeling slightly less guilty and more clear about why I'm doing this, though I know the guilt will probably come back in waves. Work becomes my main focus over the next few weeks as I dive deep into preparing for the big case I've been assigned. The case files spread across my desk, witness statements and financial records that need careful review and analysis. I spend long hours at the office going through evidence, building arguments, and planning strategy for court. The work keeps my mind busy during the day and gives me something productive to focus on, instead of constantly worrying about my mother's next move. Gwendolyn stops by my office one evening around 7 when most people have gone home and comments that my focus has been really strong lately. She adds that she's impressed but reminds me to keep some balance and not burn myself out. I appreciate her concern and tell her the work is actually helping me right now, giving me a healthy way to channel my energy. Sydney brings me coffee during another late night and sits down for a few minutes to chat. She tells me she's impressed by how I'm handling everything with my family situation, while still doing excellent work on my cases. Her support means a lot, and I thank her for being such a good colleague and friend through all this mess. 2 weeks pass after the first cease and desist letter went out, and I start to relax slightly, thinking maybe my mother finally got the message. Then Friday afternoon, I get an email from an address I don't recognize. Someone named Jennifer Delgado. I almost delete it as spam before something makes me open it and read the short message inside. The email says my mother will be at my grandmother's house on Sunday for family dinner and hopes I'll do the right thing and join them. My stomach drops as I realize my mother is using someone else's email to get around the boundaries we set. I screenshot the email immediately, forward it to Phyllis, and feel my earlier guilt disappear completely, replaced by anger at the manipulation. The fact that she's actively trying to work around the legal letter instead of respecting it makes everything crystal clear. I'm not overreacting and I'm not being too harsh. I'm dealing with someone who refuses to respect even the most basic boundaries. Phyllis responds to my forwarded email within hours, saying this workaround attempt is a clear violation of the cease and desist letter. She writes that we now have solid grounds to file for a restraining order if I want to pursue that option. I spend the whole weekend thinking about whether to take that step, whether going to court against my own mother is necessary, or if I'm making too big a deal out of this. Saturday afternoon, I drive to Kathy's house and we sit in her kitchen talking through my options. I tell her I'm worried about overreacting and making things worse by escalating to legal action. Kathy listens and then firmly reminds me that I set a clear boundary. My mother violated it on purpose, and consequences are what make boundaries real instead of just suggestions. She points out that my mother isn't going to stop unless there are actual legal consequences, that asking nicely clearly isn't working. We talk for hours, and by the time I leave, I feel more certain about what needs to happen next. Monday morning, I email Phyllis and tell her I want to hold off on the restraining order for now, but I authorize her to send a second letter. This one needs to note the violation clearly, and state that any further contact will result in immediate legal action, including restraining orders. Phyllis responds that she'll draft the letter and have it ready by the end of the day. The second letter goes out Monday afternoon via certified mail again, and I feel both stronger for having legal support and completely exhausted by needing it in the first place. Tuesday, I have my second session with Camilla, and we spend the hour talking about my mother's view of boundaries as personal attacks. Camilla helps me process the sadness of having a mother who can't or won't see boundaries as anything other than rejection. She validates that I'm doing the right thing protecting myself, and reminds me that I can't control my mother's reactions, only my own choices. Wednesday evening, my grandmother calls and I answer, hoping nothing's wrong with her health. She tells me she's decided not to host family dinners for a while because the tension between everyone is too much for her to handle. Her voice sounds tired and sad in a way that makes my heart hurt. I immediately apologize for causing all this disruption and stress in the family. My grandmother cuts me off firmly and says this isn't my fault, that she's been avoiding difficult truths about family problems for way too long. She tells me she supports my boundaries and needs some space herself to think about everything that's happened. Her support means absolutely everything to me, and I feel tears starting as I tell her I love her. I promise to visit her separately from any family gatherings, just the two of us having quiet dinners without all the drama. She agrees and says she'd like that very much, that she wants to know me without all the family politics getting in the way. Thursday afternoon, I have my next therapy session with Camilla, and we work on something she calls separating guilt from responsibility. She explains that I'm responsible for my own behavior and choices, but I'm not responsible for how my mother reacts to my boundaries. We practice different responses I can use when family members try to pressure me or make me feel guilty for protecting myself. Camilla validates over and over that taking care of my peace and safety isn't selfish. It's actually necessary and healthy. She points out that I can't pour from an empty cup, that I need to protect my own well-being before I can show up for anyone else. We role-play scenarios where relatives might guilt-trip me, and I practice staying firm without being mean or defensive. By the end of the session, I feel clearer and more solid in my choices than I have in weeks. The guilt is still there in the background, but it's quieter now, less overwhelming. I leave Camilla's office and drive home feeling like maybe I can actually get through this whole situation without falling apart. The quiet starts Friday night and stretches into the weekend, then the following week. No calls, no emails, no surprise visits. My mother's silence feels wrong, like the pause before something breaks. I check my security cameras obsessively, save every voicemail from unknown numbers just in case, keep my documentation folder open on my laptop. Kathy calls Tuesday evening and warns me not to get comfortable, says manipulators often go quiet while they regroup and plan their next move. I know she's right, but part of me wants to believe maybe the legal letter actually worked. Work becomes my anchor during the waiting. I prepare for a preliminary hearing in my high-profile case, reviewing evidence and drafting motions until my eyes blur. The hearing happens Thursday morning and I argue for 30 minutes straight, fielding questions from the judge and countering opposing counsel's objections. When the judge rules in our favor, I feel a rush of confidence that reminds me I'm good at what I do, that I built this career through actual skill and not luck. Sydney high-fives me in the hallway, and Gwendolyn sends an email complimenting my preparation. The professional win matters more than usual because everything personal feels unstable. 10 days after the second cease and desist letter, my brother calls from a number I don't recognize. I almost don't answer, but something makes me pick up. His voice sounds tight and stressed when he tells me our mother is in the hospital, that she's asking for me, that she needs family right now. The automatic guilt hits me like a wave, and for 5 seconds I'm 19 again, convinced everything is my fault. Then I pause and start asking questions instead of reacting. What happened exactly? Which hospital? What are the doctors saying? My brother hesitates before admitting she went to the emergency room for chest pain, but the test came back clear. Just anxiety and stress. She's being discharged in a few hours. The manipulation becomes obvious as he talks. The way he frames it as me needing to show up. The urgency that doesn't match the actual medical situation. I tell him I hope our mother gets appropriate care for her anxiety, but I won't be visiting and maybe he should look into therapy resources that could help her. He sounds disappointed but not surprised, and then he says something that catches me off guard. He's been thinking about moving out of her house because the constant drama is affecting his own health, giving him headaches and stomach problems. I feel a flicker of sympathy for him stuck in the middle of this, but I keep my response practical rather than emotional. I offer to send him information about affordable apartments in his price range, links to roommate finder sites, budget planning resources, help that doesn't involve my money or my involvement beyond basic information. He thanks me quietly, and we hang up. 2 days later, Phyllis calls and tells me she's been hearing through her professional networks that my mother is telling people I refuse to visit her in the hospital, painting herself as abandoned and me as heartless. The narrative spinning frustrates me because I know relatives are hearing her version, and probably believing it, probably thinking I'm cruel for not rushing to her bedside. Phyllis reminds me that I can't control what my mother tells people, only what I know to be true. She suggests I focus on the opinions of people who actually matter to me, the ones who know the full story, rather than trying to manage what extended family members think. The advice helps even though it doesn't make the frustration disappear completely. Kathy texts me Wednesday evening asking me to come for dinner Friday night. Nothing fancy, just the three of us. I assume she means her and me and maybe her husband, so I show up Friday with wine and an appetite. When I walk into her dining room, my brother is already there, sitting at the table looking nervous. Kathy explains before I can ask questions. My brother gave notice at our mother's house and he'll be moving into Kathy's guest room temporarily, while he saves money for his own place. I look at Kathy surprised she didn't tell me first, and she says she wanted us to hear it together, that she's trying to help him without putting pressure on me. The explanation makes sense, but I still feel caught off guard. My brother starts talking, words tumbling out about how sorry he is for giving our mother my address, for years of playing messenger and passing along her version of events to relatives. He says he's starting to understand how much damage the family dynamics have done, how being caught between us wasn't neutral but actually enabled a lot of harmful behavior. I accept his apology cautiously, explaining that rebuilding trust will take time, and I need him to respect my boundaries going forward. No more passing information to our mother, no more pressure to reconcile, no more guilt trips about family obligations. He agrees and seems genuine, though I remind myself that actions matter more than words. We eat dinner and talk about practical things like his moving timeline and apartment hunting, keeping it surface level but not hostile. The next week, everything explodes. Kathy calls me at work Tuesday afternoon and her voice is shaking with anger. Our mother showed up at her house an hour ago after discovering my brother gave notice, and she's on the front lawn right now yelling about betrayal and ungrateful children. Kathy has her phone recording video through the window while our mother screams that this family will regret turning on her, that she'll make sure everyone knows what kind of people abandon their own mother. Kathy calls the police non-emergency line while staying on the phone with me, calmly giving the dispatcher her address and describing the disturbance. I hear sirens in the background 15 minutes later, and Kathy narrates as 2 officers approach our mother and ask her to leave the property. Our mother goes, but not before pointing at Kathy's house and making threats about how this isn't over. Kathy sends me the video file and photos of our mother's car in her driveway. Documentation of everything. 3 days later, I receive a formal incident report from the police about the disturbance at Kathy's address. I forward it to Phyllis immediately, and she responds within an hour saying, "This strengthens our case significantly if we want to pursue a restraining order." The pattern is clear now. My mother's behavior escalating rather than improving despite legal warnings. I make the decision sitting at my desk Friday afternoon, typing out an email to Phyllis authorizing her to move forward with restraining order paperwork. She starts preparing the petition using all our documented incidents, the emails, the police report, witness statements from Kathy and my grandmother. My brother settles into Kathy's guest room and starts attending therapy twice a week, working through years of being caught between family members and used as a messenger. He calls me one evening and tells me his therapist is helping him see how much he enabled our mother's behavior by going along with it, how he needs to figure out who he is outside of that family role. I appreciate his self-awareness even though I stay cautious about rebuilding our relationship. We start meeting for coffee occasionally, 30-minute conversations at neutral locations where we talk about work and his apartment search and movies we've seen. Small steps toward being siblings again without the weight of our mother's expectations. The restraining order hearing gets scheduled 3 weeks out, and I start preparing my testimony with Phyllis, practicing staying calm and factual when describing the harassment pattern. Gwendolyn continues being supportive at work, giving me flexibility for legal appointments while making sure my caseload stays manageable. I win another motion in my high-profile case, and the victory feels especially sweet as proof that I'm maintaining professional excellence despite everything personal falling apart. Sydney comments that I seem more focused lately, and I realize that taking action, making decisions, setting legal boundaries has reduced the constant background anxiety that was eating at me for weeks. 2 days later, my grandmother calls, and I can hear the stress in her voice before she even explains. My mother showed up at her house that morning asking her to pass along messages, to tell me she just wants to talk, to convince me to drop the legal action. My grandmother sounds tired when she tells me what happened next, how she sat my mother down and said she wouldn't be a messenger between us, that everyone needed to respect boundaries, including my mother respecting mine. I feel this wave of gratitude mixed with guilt, because I know how hard that conversation must have been for her, caught between her daughter and granddaughter. She tells me she loves us both, but she won't help anyone violate someone else's boundaries, and I tell her I'm proud of her even though I know it hurts. We stay on the phone for another 20 minutes talking about her garden and her book club, normal things that feel like a gift after all the drama. The next afternoon, I'm sitting in Camilla's office for our regular session, and she shifts the focus to the upcoming hearing. We spend the hour working through my feelings about testifying against my own mother in court, and the guilt keeps trying to surface even though I know logically this is the right choice. Camilla walks me through the reality that the hearing is a consequence of my mother's choices, not mine, that protecting myself isn't an attack on her. We practice staying calm and factual when describing the harassment pattern, keeping emotions separate from the facts I need to present. She has me rehearse answering potential questions, focusing on concrete incidents with dates and details rather than how I felt about them. By the end of the session, I feel more prepared but still nervous, and Camilla reminds me that nervous is normal, and I don't need to be perfect. The week before the hearing drags by with this constant low-level anxiety humming under everything I do. Wednesday morning, I open my email and there's a message from my mother with the subject line that makes my stomach drop. She writes that she'll stop contacting me if I just drop the restraining order and let bygones be bygones, that we can both move on and forget this whole mess happened. I stare at the screen for a long time before forwarding it to Phyllis with a question about whether we should accept this offer. Phyllis calls me within the hour and we talk through the pros and cons, but she points out that my mother's made promises before and broken them. I think about the cease and desist letter my mother violated, about the pattern of escalation, about how words haven't been enough to create actual change. The decision crystallizes as we talk, and I tell Phyllis I want to proceed with the hearing because I need legal enforcement, not just another promise that might get broken next week. She adds the email to our evidence file and tells me it actually strengthens our case by showing my mother knows her behavior is wrong. The hearing day arrives and I dress carefully in a navy suit, pulling my hair back, looking every bit the federal prosecutor I am. Phyllis meets me outside the courtroom and we review our strategy one more time before going inside. The room is smaller than I expected, just a judge's bench and a few rows of seats, but my heart pounds anyway as we take our places. My mother arrives representing herself and sits across the aisle, not looking at me. When my turn comes, I walk to the witness stand and take the oath, my voice steady even though my hands are shaking. I testify clearly about the pattern of harassment starting from her showing up at my apartment, the invoice for services rendered, the police report from Kathy's house, the violations of the cease and desist letter. Phyllis guides me through each incident with questions that let me lay out the timeline in chronological order. I describe the boundary violations, the escalating behavior, the way my mother tried to use family members as messengers, and showed up at places she knew I'd be. My mother tries to interrupt twice, but the judge tells her to wait her turn. When Phyllis finishes, my mother gets to ask me questions, and she tries to paint me as vindictive, asking why I'm doing this to her when she's my mother. I keep my answers short and factual, repeating that I'm here because she violated boundaries repeatedly despite being asked to stop. Phyllis presents our documentation, laying out emails and photos and police reports on the table in front of the judge. Kathy's written statement describes the scene on her lawn, and my grandmother's statement confirms my mother tried to use her as a go-between. The judge reads through everything carefully while we sit in silence. My mother gets her chance to speak, and she talks about how I'm her daughter, and she just wanted to reconnect, how she didn't mean any harm. She says I'm overreacting and using my legal training to bully her, that families should work things out privately. The judge listens without expression, and then asks her specific questions about the cease and desist letter, about showing up at Kathy's house after being told to stay away. My mother stumbles through her answers, contradicting herself twice. When both sides finish, the judge takes a 5-minute recess to review the materials. Those 5 minutes feel like an hour. The judge comes back and starts speaking in this calm, measured tone that fills the courtroom. She grants a 1-year restraining order with specific provisions, reading them out loud while my mother's face goes red. My mother must stay at least 500 feet from my home, my workplace, and any location she knows I frequent. She cannot contact me directly through any means including phone, email, text, or social media. She can only contact me through her attorney, and only regarding genuine emergencies involving my grandmother's health or safety. The judge explains that violations will result in immediate arrest and potential jail time, and my mother needs to take this order very seriously. I feel relief wash through my entire body as the judge speaks, finally having legal protection with real consequences instead of just requests my mother can ignore. My mother stands up and her chair scrapes loudly against the floor, and she walks out of the courtroom without looking back, but I can see the anger in every line of her body. Phyllis squeezes my shoulder and tells me I did great, that the order is solid and enforceable. We collect our documents and head out into the hallway where Kathy is waiting. I suggested she meet me for lunch instead of sitting through the hearing, but she wanted to be nearby. We drive to a quiet restaurant a few blocks away and order sandwiches neither of us really tastes. Kathy tears up when I thank her for everything, for the years of support and the documentation and showing up today. She tells me she's proud of me for protecting myself, and she wishes she'd stepped in more forcefully years ago, when my mother first cut me off. I reach across the table and take her hand, telling her she saved my life when I had nothing, and that's more than enough. We toast with our water glasses to chosen family and to boundaries that actually stick. The relief I feel over the next few days is almost physical, like I've been holding my breath for months and can finally exhale. Work life stabilizes immediately because the constant fear of my mother appearing at the office or contacting my colleagues is gone. I throw myself into my cases with energy I haven't had in weeks, and Gwendolyn notices the change. She comments that I seem more like myself than I have in months, more focused and present in meetings. Sydney and I win a significant motion together in the high-profile case, and the whole team goes out for drinks to celebrate. I sit at the bar with my colleagues laughing at someone's story about a courtroom mishap, and I realize I'm genuinely happy in this moment without any background anxiety ruining it. 2 months later, my brother calls to invite me to see his new apartment. He moved out of Kathy's guest room after saving enough for first month's rent and a deposit, and he sounds excited when he gives me the address. I drive over on a Saturday afternoon and find a small studio in an older building. Nothing fancy but clean and his. He gives me the tour, which takes about 30 seconds since it's one room plus a bathroom, but he's visibly proud of the space and the independence it represents. We order pizza and eat sitting on his floor since he only has one chair so far, and he thanks me for not completely shutting him out despite his role in the family mess over the years. I tell him I'm glad he's building his own life separate from our mother's control, and we spend the rest of the afternoon talking about his job and his plans to take some community college classes. It feels like the beginning of an actual sibling relationship without all the baggage and manipulation. My grandmother and I fall into a routine of quiet dinners at her house every other week, just the two of us without any other family drama. We talk about her life and my work, about books she's reading and cases I'm preparing, and it's peaceful in a way family gatherings never were. She tells me one evening that she's relieved clear boundaries are in place even though the whole situation makes her sad, and she makes me promise to keep pursuing my career goals. These evenings become this healing thing for both of us, proof that family relationships can be healthy and supportive when people respect each other. 6 months after that Thanksgiving revelation, I'm sitting in a meeting with my supervisor and she's talking about my performance on the high-profile case. We won, got the outcome we wanted, and apparently I impressed some important people with my preparation and courtroom presence. Gwendolyn mentions potential for advancement, maybe a lead position on the next major case that comes through. I realize sitting there that protecting my boundaries actually freed up mental energy that's making me better at my job, that I'm not constantly distracted by family drama anymore. My reputation at work is solid, built on successful cases and thorough preparation, and nobody knows about the restraining order or the family mess except the few people I chose to tell. I have dinner with Kathy that weekend and tell her about the potential advancement, and she raises her glass with this huge smile. My brother texts to say he enrolled in 2 classes for next semester. My grandmother sends me a card with a note about how proud she is. The restraining order sits in my file cabinet at home, 6 months in with no violations, and I'm finally building the life I always wanted. My brother texts 3 weeks later saying our mother sold the house and moved into a small apartment across town. He adds that she got a job at a retail store and seems focused on paying off debts, and he's keeping his distance but knows she's managing. I read the message twice, waiting for some big feeling to hit, but all I get is this quiet acknowledgement that consequences are real things that happen to everyone. The restraining order paperwork sits in my file cabinet with 0 violations marked, and I check it sometimes just to confirm the clean record. My lawyer sends an email confirming no attempted contacts through legal channels either, and I file that away too. Kathy calls on Friday and invites me to dinner at her place the following week, mentions my brother and grandmother are coming too. I stop at the wine shop on my way over and spend 20 minutes picking out a good bottle, something nicer than my usual grocery store choice. My brother shows up with a bakery box of fancy desserts, looking more relaxed than I've seen him in months. We help Kathy set the table, and my grandmother arrives with fresh flowers, and the whole evening unfolds without anyone bringing up my mother or family drama or anything heavy. We eat Kathy's lasagna and talk about my grandmother's book club, and my brother's new apartment furniture, and Kathy's garden plans. After dinner, we clear the dishes, and my grandmother suggests cards, so we play gin rummy at the kitchen table for 2 hours. My brother keeps making jokes about my grandmother's card-counting skills, and Kathy refills our wine glasses, and nobody's keeping score of who's winning or losing. My grandmother says this is what family dinners should feel like, and we all agree without needing to say much more. I drive home that night feeling settled in a way I didn't know was possible with family. Camilla and I spend my next therapy session working through what she calls complicated grief, the loss of a relationship that never existed the way I wanted it to. She has me write down qualities I wished my mother had, then qualities the people in my life actually show me, and the second list is longer and more specific. Kathy's consistency, my grandmother's gentle support, my brother's growing self-awareness, even Camilla's steady presence every week. She points out that I built this network myself, chose people who chose me back, and that's not settling for less but creating something real. We talk about my sleep improving and the anxiety that used to wake me up at 3 in the morning, fading to occasional sad moments I can actually process. I leave her office and grab coffee with a colleague and realize I went the whole session without crying, just working through ideas like any other problem I solve. The calendar flips past months of steady work and quiet dinners and therapy sessions until it's been a full year since that Thanksgiving dinner. I'm preparing for a major trial, spending late nights at the office reviewing witness statements and building arguments. My brother texts me photos of his new couch and asks if I want to grab lunch next week, and I say yes. Kathy and I have dinner every other Thursday like clockwork, and my grandmother comes over once a month to cook her special recipes in my kitchen. The restraining order renewal paperwork arrives in the mail, and I fill it out without hesitation, knowing I'll extend it for another year. My mother hasn't tried to contact me through any channel, and I hear through my brother she's working full-time and staying focused on her own situation. I win a preliminary motion in my trial, and my supervisor mentions possible advancement again. I'm sitting at my desk late one evening looking at case files, and I realize my life doesn't revolve around my mother's approval anymore. Doesn't center on her attacks or her presence or her absence. I built something solid with people who actually show up, set boundaries that protect the peace I worked for, and finally understand that choosing myself wasn't cruel, but necessary.